Are you recording?
Yes.
Anyway,
Yes,
I bid you a warm welcome this morning. End of my storytelling. That's it. Good morning. I'm going to unmute now. You want to say something?
You're unmuted.
Okay.
You're unmuted.
Okay. I'm done. Thank you. Glad to be part of this.
I didn't mean for the recording to throw you off. It just should have been turned on sooner. That's our bad. Harlan, welcome. And I think you're going to share your screen, so make sure that happens. It just feels like friends are here this morning. And I met Harlan in Winnipeg, and that's where I first heard one of his talks. And he was so knowledgeable, and he's so charismatic, and gave me tips so that my presentation would be more alive, because it wasn't. We were at a conference, but I wanted Harlan here to share and spread that knowledge. I know the time in my life, it was very helpful to have met Harlan, and it's like the stars were aligned and we met. So Harlan, could you just introduce yourself and your presentation, but introduce yourself in a way that you're comfortable with?
Thank you so much, Tansek. Harlan Pruden, Egua Wakat no Mani, Egua Motormouth Mabel, Nika Kasan, Niha Ayakwe. Kinunas Comtenina Wawa, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Egua Murray Smith, Emalaha Murray, and thank you very much for some of your teachings and also your language and place of what is it? Hey? No, hey you? What was the language?
Lachain, yeah, Lachain.
Lachain.
Yeah. And they didn't know how to spell it, so they call it Cane Island, and it's Lachain.
Lachain. Well, Kironas, Mista, which is big in our language. Mista Kironas Komtinin. A big thank you so much. So my government name is Harlan Pruden.
That's a good one. My government name, I'll use that too.
Yes. Cool. My government name is Harlan Pruden. My Indian name, and I do use the I word. You can ask me why I use that I word. Is actually it's in Sioux. I was doing some Two-Spirit work on the Rosebud Reservation, and they honored me with the name Waka no Mani. Waka being spirit, good spirit, neutral spirit, or bad spirit. I can do good just as well as I can do bad, or I can suck up a lot of space, which I hope I don't do, and do nothing. And so that part of my name, Waka, is how do I want to show up? And so I try to show up with good words, good actions, and good thoughts. And when I fall short of that intention, a mistake is only a mistake if we don't learn from it. So every misstep and mistake is a learning opportunity, is built into my name. Nom is to, and Mani is a sacred journey. And so I was going to get that translated into Cree. Okay, now there's two pens in my hair. I was going to get that translated into Cree. I am First Nations Cree, and in my humble opinion, the best nation in the whole wide world. Fighting words, I know, but I'm trying to model that all my life I was growing up and that's why I will jump to that of explaining of why I use the I word. Because as Wab Canoe so poignantly writes in his book, The Reason Why I Walk, like Wab and like myself and for many Indigenous peoples, me growing up, is that Indian always had an adjective. Dirty Indian, stupid Indian, drunk Indian. And so I was always ashamed of me being an Indian, and then I was also incredibly ashamed of me being a little sissy boy. And so to take those words back and to reclaim them. And so if someone calls me, hey, Indian, I'm like, yeah, so? Yes, that's who I am, Indian through and through. As I take the power back from it, and that's why I use the word. Anyway, so I am First Nations Cree. My mother is from the Beaver Lake Indian Reserve. My father is a member of the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. When my mother married my father, her band registry went to Saddle Lake, and I'm a registered member of the Saddle Lake Indian Reserve. And those are two different communities, but they are the signatories to Treaty 6, and so I'm a member of a numbered treaty. I also would like to humbly thank the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations and peoples whose territory and land in which that I live on today. Now, this land acknowledgement, as you all know, when I I lived in New York for 20 years, and when I moved here in 2015, everyone was like doing land acknowledgements, right? And then Native people were never mentioned again, ever, in the presentation, or in the talk, or in the programming. And I'm like, well, what the heck was that land acknowledgement? And so what I do is unpack it, and it's just not some sort of perfunctory statement. This is me humbly acknowledging that I am a guest in and on the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations people. And as a result of me being a guest, I carry myself as a guest in a good way and a humble way. Because if I don't, I run the risk that my hosts will look at me and say, and make nasty, well, rightly, if I'm not carrying myself in a good way, they will think nasty things of me, as they should. And so what I try to do is to carry myself not only as a guest, but an ambassador for my Cree people. Because if I'm not carrying myself in a good way, my host may think nasty things about Harlan, but may make discernments and judgments around my Cree people. And so I carry myself as an ambassador for my Cree people, for my Two-Spirit people. And I think we all have people, and your people show up in the room before you show up in the room. So I just keep that in mind. And so that land acknowledgement is to position and to ground me, but also to acknowledge of where I am as a guest in and on, and to pay honor to the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Now, also, I'm getting a little, that I know that for land acknowledgements, I always like folks, many say like ancestral, traditional, and unceded territory of blah, 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 right? Oh, okay, now something's going on with our screens.
We're all good. We're
Okay.
we're all here. Sorry.
Well,
Don't let that throw you off.
yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is that for the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, right? I'm on technically their traditional territory, but I'm also on their contemporary. Like, this is their territory, this is their land. And so I'm like stripping out ancestral or traditional and just acknowledging on whose land I am. So I'm just like working through these things of like, what are we really saying when we do these land acknowledgements? So I would just like to thank Elder Murray for opening us in a good way, and just sharing a little bit about their language and your language, because our language is our placeholder for culture, but it's also our placeholder for knowledge. I'd also like to thank Julie for this opportunity to share some of the work around Two-Spirit. So let's jump in. Okay, and my third name is Motormouth Mabel, because I have a lot of information to share with you. And why I share so much information is because you're only going to remember 15%. So if I throw 300% at you, we can maybe up that 15 to around like 30%, right? No, I'm only teasing. Go. Share. Screen share. Okay, what is everyone seeing on?
We can see it. Water teachings taking the path of least resistance.
Perfect. And is it in screen sharing mode and you don't see a strip on the left-hand side of all my other slides?
Correct. Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. So water teachings, taking the path of least resistance, methodological reflections on the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, on capacity bridging within communities across Turtle Island. So here is our current iteration of all of the members of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. I will talk a little bit about the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, actually a lot about the Two-Spirit Dry Lab and the work of who we are. But I just wanted to show you that we have about 36 members. And then we also have members that have, like, because of taking other positions, they've kind of like stepped away, but they are a part of, and they can be jumping into the lab at any time and rejoin us. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on as a guest in and on the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, and the Musqueams First Nations, and I give the honor, but also just acknowledge that, and I also just want to thank them for tolerating my presence in and on their territory and their land. So our time together, one is I'm going to do a high-level summary of what and who Two-Spirit people are, the how and the what of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. And then I'm going to do really quickly, like literally 3 slides, a juxtaposition of Western knowledge translation and production versus Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, or Indigenous knowledge translation or mobilization. Research as reconciliation and honoring Two-Spirit people and ways. This will also be the decolonization of the research ecosystem, so that we're given an opportunity through research to be in good relations with amongst one another. And then finally, because I will be talking really fast, is we'll be looking at questions, comments, and conversations, which I say QCC. So Two-Spirit people. So the concept of Two-Spirit. First of all, it's important to notice that it's on there's no one definition for Two-Spirit. And so what I'm offering is a framework of how do we understand this concept or this term of Two-Spirit. So first of all, Two-Spirit is a community organizing tool or strategy and not an identity. Implicit with identity is that it becomes an endpoint. So kind of like when I came out as gay, I started seeking out the gay community. And then what I had to try to figure out is, what is gay? Who is gay? And then I kind of fleshed out my gay identity, right? In amongst a community of support and a community of practice, being the gay community. Two-Spirit, on the other hand, is a way that we can use to identify those individuals who are Indigenous to Turtle Island and are also gender and or sexually diverse or non-binary. And those are the 2 interlocking concepts of indigeneity and gender and sexually diverse individuals that they may answer the call of what Two-Spirit. If you're not Indigenous and you're not gender and or sexually diverse, then you cannot use the term Two-Spirit. So within it, also Two-Spirit, it doesn't make sense unless it's contextualized or embedded within an Indigenous community or framework. And then finally, which is a markedly different markedly different than often broader conversations, is that within a pre-contact setting, Two-Spirit was a gender analysis as opposed to a sexual orientation analysis, meaning that we often define Two-Spirit as being Indigenous and LGBTQI, right? But within a pre-contact setting, we didn't have concepts like lesbian, gay, or bisexuality. I'll unpack that in a little bit. But we did have, some nations had 2 different genders, a men's camp and a women's camp. While other nations or peoples had maybe 3 genders. Some had 4 genders. Some nations had 12 different genders. How do we understand of a world that has more than 2 genders of men and women? And we'll unpack that in a little bit. And then we'll also kind of see how it becomes a little problematic around this whole sexual orientation and ways in which that we have to find to rework this and have different conversations. Today, most people associate the term of Two-Spirit with lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, non-binary, gender non-queer. That little plus can go on and on. Indigenous peoples However, the work of Two-Spirit organizations, leaders, and community members is more akin to this traditional understanding of who were we within a pre-contact setting and what is the relevancy as well as the application of those terms and those knowledge for today's Indigenous, gender, and sexually diverse folks. Now, where did Two-Spirit come from? So those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition, we had our own words within our own language that identified, accounted, and was used by Two-Spirit people. So in my talk, in my introduction, I modeled that in addition to saying that I am First Nations Cree, Niha Nehiao, I also said that I am Two-Spirit, Niha Ayakwe. Now, I didn't say I was a man, with Niha Napueo, nor did I say I was a woman, Niha Asquia. I said I was Two-Spirit, Niha Ayakwe. So those nations that had a Two-Spirit tradition and Two-Spirit relatives that walked amongst them, we had our own terms within our own languages that named, accounted, and identified our Two-Spirit relatives. Now, I put 1492. That's not really when it happened. It was a little after 1492. 1492 is a big year for us, right? As Indigenous people, because that's when CC stumbled upon our shores, right? And the Indigenous people of the Greater Antilles, which we would know that area today, they woke up. Well, CC comes to shore, stabs down the flag and says, "Ha ha, I have discovered you." Well, the counter narrative to that is the Indigenous people of the Greater Antilles on October 10th, they woke up and they discovered CC on their shores. So this is incredibly important. In that, what is your framework? Because those true realities hold true. In one, that we were discovered, or two, that we discovered him. And so it's a broader framework that is at play in that one, what is that framework in which that we were discovered? Or is there another framework at play that we discovered? And so we just always be conscious of what are those frameworks in the back that allow which one of those truths hold true. And we put them into concert. So there were these French missionaries that were wandering around Turtle Island in the early 16th century, about 1525 to 1545, these French missionaries were wandering around Turtle Island, and they saw these like males that were hanging out and doing the work of women and taking on women's dress, right? Or there were females that were hanging out and doing the work of men and going on hunts and war parties. And so the French missionaries are like, this doesn't fit into my rigid binary gender system in which there are only men and women. You know, just like the good book says, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? And they're like, what do we call them? What do we call them? So there was this Persian word, barja, that spread throughout Europe. It first shows up in Italian, bardasso, then it shows up in Spanish, bardaxa, and in the early 16th century here on this territory and land, it shows up in French as berdache. But if we go back to that Persian word, barja, it literally translates into a young man or boy who serves as a succubus. Y'all have to Google that word because it's a crazy A word. Succubus, succubus. Or another definition is a young man or boy who is a passive homosexual partner. Okay, what are they saying? So on man hot sex, and we hope it's hot, right? Because it's just a waste of time when it's not, right? You're like, yes, beige. I should paint the ceiling beige, right? That's not the type of sex, right? We're talking. But on man hot sex, there is what we would say is a top and or an anal male receptive partner, i.e. the bottom, right? What they were narrowly talking about with the term is within the word berdache, was only of the bottom, the anal male receptive partner, not the top. And so for many, many years, the term was used within the community, but it was also picked up by the academy. And I've seen many, many books prior to 1989, 1990, in which that uses that word berdache. Now, starting in 1975 with the founding of the Gay American Indians organization by Randy Burns, Barbara Cameron, as well as other community leaders in the Bay Area, there began this consciousness, and it culminated at there was a conversation that started in 1989 and it concluded in 1990 at the third annual Basket and Bow Gathering of Gay and Lesbian Native Americans. And that year in 1990, it was held just outside of Winnipeg, where Julie and I met. And at that, the attendees of that gathering there were many, many folks from different nations there. What they did was, after many, many rounds and much discussions, they landed on the term Two-Spirit. They wanted a term that reflected a combination of masculinity and femininity, which attributed to males and feminine roles and females and masculine roles. And there we get a pivot. The pivot was around your role within society, i.e. gender, and it was a pivot away from sexual orientation. But it was also an act and the ultimate act of sovereignty of land, but also sovereignty of body. We were claiming our bodies. In that, as the community, we were like saying, hey, you members of the clergy or you members of the academy that named us and or used the term Berdache, you have no right to name us. That right belongs to us. And we choose Two-Spirit. Now, this sent the Academy into flummox, because they're like, what do you mean we can't use that word? I've seen papers written up to around 1986. I found a paper about 4 years ago, and it was a European master's or PhD student that still used the term Berdache. That was like within the last 4 years that I saw that. So if you see the scholarship and or a paper that uses the term Two-Spirit, cross it out. Sorry, that uses Berdache, cross it out and write Two-Spirit. The scholarship may hold true, but the nomenclature and the use of this highly derogatory base term of Berdache we find it offensive and we do not like it. Now, when you're writing Two-Spirit, please do not use two-spirited. We're not a verb. Don't use two-spiritedness. We're not an adjective. We're just a proper noun. Two-spirit. And I know Word will not like you because it'll always be a little red line, but please just use Two-Spirit and don't make us a non-noun or non-proper noun use within that term. Now, how do we understand a world that has more than two genders? Now, I'm not going to go through this entire list. This is a survey. I just looked across Turtle Island and I just picked and chose a couple of examples. And each of these examples, each entry is nation specific. So I'm not going to go through every item on this list, but I just want to share with you that one is Two-Spirit is going to mean something different depending on what nation the individual is of and a member of, or from and a member of. Now, okay, so if I were to make you all a part of the Cree Nation, first of all, how does it feel to be a part of the best nation in the whole wide world? You're like, fighting words. But if in our Cree world is that we had, in our Cree ontology, is that we had two big dominant camps, or two big dominant camps. The Napweo, who were what we would translate into men, and the Esquia, what we would translate into women. And we also had a separation and a division of labor. And so our Napweo hunted and our Esquia gathered, right? And also the way that us Crees worked is that a Napweo was never allowed in an Esquia camp, and Esquia was never allowed in a Napweo camp. Well, was that good? Was that bad? Well, I just like to suspend judgment or critique. That's just the way it was, right? We can talk about that later, but that's just how we formed our societies. Those were the rules, right? And so if there was ever imbalance or disharmony amongst these two big dominant camps, right? A Napweo couldn't walk over to the Esquia camp and say, hey, Esquia, what's going on, right? And then Esquia couldn't walk over to the Napweo camp because they weren't allowed in those spaces, right? But us as a Yaakwe, we had unfettered and equal access to both camps, and that we could go back and forth. And so we could walk over to the Esquia camp and like, hey, Esquia, what's going on? What's happening? That's interesting, right? We could walk over to the Napueo camp and we're like, hey, Napueos, what's the skinny? What's going on? What are you silly gooses up to today? Like, oh, I'll be right back. And you could go back and I could go back and forth and I could mediate and conflict or resolve the tension, hopefully, to put them back into balance and so that they were not at each other's throats. And Napueo couldn't do that, and Esquia couldn't, but just as a Yaakwe, we could do that. Now, another way of thinking about it is Napueo hunting, Esquia gathering, those were their roles. Our roles were one of mediation and being pass-throughs or go-betweens the two camps. And so for those nations that had 12 genders or 10 genders or 4 genders, they had 12 different camps, and each camp providing a different role for their society that no other gender could perform. So that's Cree. If I were Sioux, one, I wouldn't be known as a Yaakwe, I'd be known as a Winkte, and there would not be a social expectation as a Winkte for being a go-between, but there would be a social, a go-between camps, but there would be a social expectation that I'd be the officiant at a naming ceremony. And so my good friend Del First, who is Winkte and Sioux, has stepped back in and resurrected that role, but also a part of that ceremony. Now, the takeaway is that Two-Spirit is going to mean something different if you're Cree, and it's also going to mean something, your role, if you look at it, is also going to be functionally different if you were Sioux, Anishinaabe, if you were, if you're each Two-Spirit, it has to be defined, and it's nation specific. And I hope you understand that. So it's just, that's why if Two-Spirit is positioned as an identity, a one way of being, it gets very problematic because Two-Spirit is going to mean something different if you're Cree or you're Sioux, as I just unpacked in this one example. Now, I've collected about 130 terms for Two-Spirit people. This is built off of Willie Roskau's work. And I'm sorry, the citation isn't here. It's in, oh no, I'm missing the first slide. Give me 1 sec. I am so sorry. Julie, please step in and with some nice.
Well, thank you for for finding the screen or the slide that's missing. So I really like that. When you said suspend judgment, unfettered equal access, and defined nation specific, and I think that is really key because some of our I'm going to say Two-Spirit people say they're not, but I'm thinking maybe it's because they don't know how it's defined in their nation, because it's perhaps something that we don't really talk about. So yeah, I remember that the list that you had from before. So that 15% that I retained,
Cool. And I don't know how Blue Jean works, but I can't see. I just I'm talking to my own slides, and so I feel it really awkward. So I'm happy that we're out.
I think I fixed it. Is that better?
You
see us on
let
the
me
bottom?
Go back into screen sharing.
Yeah, there it is.
You should see us on the bottom, but it's hard with the PowerPoint. Yeah, it's like you're talking into a black hole. It's terrible. I apologize. Zoom is the good-looking brother of Blue Jeans. We know this.
Okay. So I'll just keep the chat function open, and so folks, because I'm now just talking to myself. I see myself. All right. So here's some Two-Spirit names. Again, I'm building upon Willie Roscow's 1988 work, where he worked with like Barbara Cameron, Randy Burns, as well as other folks for the Bay Area Gay American Indian Organization. Now, I've collected about 150 terms. This database, one, is riddled with inaccuracies. It is also just flat out wrong information, and there are some blatant omissions. And you're like, wait a minute, tap the brakes, Harlan. How are you getting out misinformation? The next 9 slides are used to support conversations, right? And a part of that is how you use this database. Like right now, I met some Acoma speakers. And so I'm working on this entry for a translation. And of course, I grabbed the wrong slide. Please ignore all of the male and the female assigned language. It'll go away in the next slide. We're trying to be like the whole thing around the positioning of like male assigned. That's like a Western term. We just want you to know that there are terms for folks, and they are for biological males and biological females. But male assigned is or female assigned is a relatively new term, and so we're just trying to figure that out. Anyway, so I am working with Acoma people to clean up this entry to see whether or not that they have a Two-Spirit term for female folks. And I'm also currently working with the Stolo Nation and some of their knowledge and language keepers to get their word. And Stolo is just south of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations territory. Now, you will see that the Cree entry is a good, clean entry. It was validated by 21 primary Cree speakers. And so if you don't see your nation, I invite you to see if you can do the work to find out what is your word within, if you have a tradition, what are those words within the language for your Two-Spirit relatives. The Nikapi Nation, I just updated that last Friday. So this has only been in the database. It was gifted and honored. This knowledge was gifted and honored to me. So this is only the second presentation with this new information. I just want to like. This Tlingit entry is, I'm working on this Tlingit entry right now with some folks up in the Yukon, because when the ethnographers, the European ethnographers, that's why it's like loose translation, and I'm like, working through the translation process, right? But what I found was like for this term, of coward, right? When the ethnographer goes, what does that word mean, right? And more than likely the community was like, yeah, that means that the person doesn't fight. They're a part of their role is they just don't go on war parties, right? And the European ethnographer goes, we have a word for that, coward, right? And so although there are like some negative sounding translations, it's just that we have to go in and find better translations, like switching out. And so right now we're just validating with some Tlingit primary speakers, language speakers, on is there a better translation? And then when we get 3 people to agree, it's a double validation process, an initiate and a double validation process for the translation. And then what we do is we update the database. And so I'm just trying to figure out and get all 3 primary Tlingit speakers to come up with one agreed upon translation. That's why this is taking so long and why I'm getting this information out now, where I wish that I could sit up in the academy and comb through this and make this a beautiful, pristine database that's all shiny. But that could take me a lifetime. Heck, it could take 3 lifetimes. And in those intervening lifetime or times, more of this information will be lost. And so those 9 slides are just to share that, 1, what we know right now, but 2 is that if you don't see your nation, please help us for the reclamation of these words. And then 2 is, if you see your nation, validate it. Is it the correct words? Are there more terms? And or is it a good translation, or does the translation also have to be cleaned up? And so it's only meant to support a conversation. Now, these words are so incredibly important. For where there's a word, there's a story, there's a people. The more just there's a people, but there's a history, right? In absence of these words, well as this framing, our LGBT Indigenous relatives have to make a decision, are often forced to make a decision because they're called nasty words like fag or queer or lesbian or dyke, and they're forced from their community. Only to show up at a two-spirit. Like if a Zuni person shows up, and they don't know their word, lahamana, we gift them their word lahamana, and then a framework for them to understand. And then it is the conversation and the medicine of these words is the individual may go, what is lahamana? Who is lahamana? And what is my role as a lahamana for my Zuni people? And calls them home and centers their Zuniness or their ingenuity as a Zuni person. And that, I think, is so beautiful. And so it's like this just centering of who they are through this one word. Often I've seen folks are like, what do you mean I don't have to choose between being LGBT and being Zuni? I can just be Zuni? And I'm like, yeah. And that is the beauty part of this decolonization of these terms. And that often tension of being Indigenous and LGBT, where you can just be Indigenous, and a part of your ingenuity is your gender and or your sexual diversity that is honoring of that. Now, we're not alone. If you look at other Indigenous communities across the world, although they wouldn't use Two-Spirit, Two-Spirit is only here for Turtle Island. We have the Kinnar in India, the Bulbul in Pakistan, the Mahu in Hawaii, the Fa'afafin in Samoa. And again, this is an incomplete list. But it also is a reminder for me is that there should be work of an international convening similar to the 1990 convening, where Two-Spirit was agreed upon, an international convening of how do we want to organize? Is it Two-Spirit? Is it something else? Or it is a multiplicity? Like we haven't had that conversation yet. And so for me to impose our Two-Spirit nomenclature or framework onto these people, I would be a colonizer enforcing our way on the world, right? So I'm not, it's just the takeaway is, that we're all Indigenous from someplace. And that there may be sexually and diverse ways of knowing and being and doing when it comes to sexuality as well as gender that may be within your own world if you are, if within your own culture as well as your own Indigenous roots. And so that is all that I want to share with you with that slide. Now, who are some of our Two-Spirit heroes from way back? So there are only about 20 known historical images. I have all of the images, and I'm only going to show you 2. One is like of Wiwa from the Zuni nation, who is Ilhamana, and the other is there's so many names. There's like Otish for this one individual, Otish, or finds them and kills them, or Squad Jim. With the individual on the right. Not Otish. For the Zuni picture is there's an entire biography that was written by Willie Roscoe on Wiwa's life, and it's a beautiful biography, and I would encourage you to read that. Now, we cannot talk about Two-Spirit without unpacking and understanding what is representative in this picture. I'm sure that you are all familiar with this picture, and this is a picture from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the first school that opened up for residential schools for Indigenous students. Now, it was on decommissioned Army barracks. It was done in Pennsylvania, just outside of Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And what does this have to do with being Two-Spirit? Well, Oh, no. I'm getting ahead of myself. So some fun facts about this school. One is that about 100,000 Native children went through its doors when it was in operation. It opened in 1879 and closed in 1918. It was founded by this army dude named Richard Henry Pratt that prided himself in beating people into submission. And it's also this school is where we get that saying, or that colloquial saying of like, kill the Indian to save the man. Or another way of understanding that, taking Native American children, removing the nativeness so that they were American. And of the 100,000 children that went through this one school, do you know what the graduation rate was? 0.158. We can be generative and go 0.2%. Could you imagine if your school had a graduation rate of 0.2%? Would you be a school? No, they would defund you immediately and you would not have certification. But that's not what happened here. John A. McDonald, good old Johnny, sent Duncan Scott down here. Duncan Scott was like, wow, this is a beautiful program. Let's come back and replicate it in Canada with its 0.2 graduation rate. Hitler came over and studied this and was like, wow, this is a beautiful program. And I will use it as the basic architecture for my final solution, the eradication of all of the Jewish, as well as Polish or anyone that was non-Aryan. So what does this have to do with being Two-Spirit? Well, this has everything, and it has nothing to do with being Two-Spirit. You're like, tap the brakes. How can it be everything and nothing? Everything, well, we will talk about, and both truths hold true. Both truths hold true. So if we deconstruct the subject matter of this one picture, we'll see that in this section of the picture, we have, I would say, boys or young men. And why I'm coding them that way is that we look at the gender expression, haircut over the ears, and that they're wearing pantsuits. So their gender expression is boy or young men. Now in the bottom third over here is that, again, they are all young women or girls. And again, I'm reading that through their gender expression of shoulder length hair and dresses. Now, this is where we get that imposition of that rigid binary gender system that was imposed upon us as Indigenous people, leaving room for only their two genders. We as Two-Spirit people are not forced to the margins. We're forced completely out of that picture. Gone are the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth different genders, or the 12 different genders, leaving room for only their two genders. This is a story of the colonization, but it is also the colonization of sexuality, as well as gender, as well as culture, as well as language, and you know all of the intricacies of these interlocking systems of oppression. They just share that with you all, that this picture and this system has everything and nothing to be doing Two-Spirit. I know there are Two-Spirit people. I will bet my eye teeth. I'll also bet my hair that there are Two-Spirit people and Two-Spirit relatives in there, but they're erased and gone. Currently, there are Two-Spirit leaders and activists like Gail Pruden or Alex Wilson, and there are hundreds of other Two-Spirit leaders and activists, and I'm just highlighting two of my favorites. I also just want to share this on March 21st. This year is the second annual Two-Spirit Day that officially recognized in British Columbia, both from the city of Vancouver, and then we also got a proclamation from the legislature in Vancouver for the Two-Spirit celebration and Awareness Day. And here's APTN that did a story on it.
Hey, Pruden, or hey, Harlan, we can't hear the sound. I wonder,
How can we do this?
um, do you have a link to the video we could share maybe
Okay,
after? Yeah,
perfect.
that's the only kind of workaround I can imagine right
Perfect.
now.
Then we'll
Yep.
do that. Cool. So, Two-Spirit is the intersection of those who embody diverse sexuality and gender, roles and roles and expressions. Two-Spirit people are indigenous to Turtle Island. It is a community organizing tool and a strategy and not an identity. It becomes highly problematic when it's positioned as an identity. It is going to mean something different depending on what nation an individual is from or a member of. And it also refers to a history or tradition that predates these Western notions and concepts such as LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex. And it's about reclaiming and restoring our rightful place of honor, respect, and dignity within the individual's nation. This is deep decolonizing work that centers one's ingenuity and calls Two-Spirit people home and is thereby around mending of the sacred hoop. All right, let's talk about the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. Let's go back into this mode. So the Two-Spirit Dry Lab is Turtle Island's first ever research group that solely focuses on Two-Spirit people, communities, and experiences. We call ourselves the Dry Lab because we are not a bench lab, meaning we don't wear lab coats, we do not specimens, we don't do beakers or Bunsen burners. We use computers and we use data, so none of this gets wet with specimens, right? So we're a dry lab as opposed to a wet lab or a bench lab. This is last May, the Two-Spirit Dry Lab. Some of the members, again, joined and we went out to Loon Lake in Maple Ridge and we had our strategic planning session. And again, you can see that we are very diverse within our and who we are as Indigenous and settler researchers coming together with a unity of purpose. Now, often when research groups get together, there's always an attentiveness to what. What are we going to do? What are we going to study? And so as Indigenous people, what we try to do is the attentiveness is looking at process. How do we gather and how do we come together, right? And so a part of that is the centering of Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. We are a multidisciplinary collaboration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous epidemiologists, knowledge translation leads, sociologists, researchers, community members, artists, and of course we have two elders, Elder Glida and Elder Roberta Price, that helps us making sure that our work is good work and that we're doing it in a good way. We also make a best effort to use Indigenous methodologies and approaches. We take a two-eyed seeing approach, which is a teaching from the Mi'kmaq Elder Marshall, where from one eye, or lens, we look at, there are good things around that Westerners have brought, or from a Western ontology, right? Not everything the colonizers and the settlers brought are bad, right? I sit here in a very soft, comfy shirt rather than a scratchy leather shirt, right? On the other hand, is that there are some really good, often really good things from an Indigenous framework, Indigenous teachings. And what we do is we hold the goodness of those two systems and we put them into concerts. And we don't play them off. We just put them into concert with one another. Our meetings and works are all done in the circle, is how we are formed and we're led. So we're collaborative, non-hierarchical. Everything is done in a circle. And there is also consensus decision-making processes. We move as one. And so we are a lab of and for shared leadership. So our team, again, was drawn together with a unity of purpose, with a deep commitment to consensus decision-making process, with an aim or a requirement of acceptance of all lab members. And these are combined with the following principles or tools of leadership. And they're also rooted in our ways, right? Again, equality in conversational turn-taking, Even though I'm the principal investigator for a CIHR-funded initiative to support the lab, where I can call all the shots, I can tell them everyone what to do, but I don't do that. In that we go into it, using our talking circle protocols, and every lab member has a voice. Every lab member brings their gifts to the conversation, and we move as one. And also, if you look at Sean Wilson in Research's Ceremony or Research's Reconciliation, another beautiful book by Sean Wilson and Margaret Wilson, I think. And also, or like Evelyn Steinhauer from the University of Alberta, who is in the Department of Education, is an actual relative of mine, is that all knowledge is relational. And as a result of that, all knowledge is relational, we take the time to get to know one another, to build that network of relationships. Now, you're like, well, how do you mean like all knowledge is relational? Well, we can have a cure for cancer, but if you don't have a network to share that cure or that knowledge, and or you use information that is so incredibly inaccessible to your network, and you can't communicate it, do you have a cure for cancer? No. A priori to knowledge is relationship. And so we must take the time to build beautiful relations so that there is a possibility for knowledge. But if we're building the relationships, that knowledge will be good knowledge. And it can't be extractive knowledge or knowledge that I use to beat you down or to say that you're not good, because how can we have that and still maintain a good relationship? Finally, listening attentively or active of what we call deep listening. And not only do we listen to what is being said, but we also listen into the void, what is not being said, and then just checking in to making sure that it is good what we're hearing, or that we're taking in, and we're hearing exactly what people are putting down. The above components create a possibility for psychological safety. Okay, this is a two-eyed seeing approach. We wouldn't just say that. We would just say being in good relations with one another, resulting in the following outcomes: supporting each other to bring forth the best ideas, working together in mindful, respectful, and I would even argue, loving ways. Now, and then 2 is developing innovative capabilities, the possibility. So the how, I think, is more important, that I want you to take away of like, how are we gathering and how does the work happen? And if we get the how, the what will take care of itself. Now, we are a lab of shared and community-driven capacity bridging research. We're trying to develop these models, and that's why because we don't know, there are elements of community-based participatory research, but there's also more that's going on. And so we're trying to just develop different ways. And so that's why we have these very clunky terms. So you will see that we work with LGBT communities, and we also work with Indigenous communities. And then when they intersect, we also work with Two-Spirit communities. And so this is our, a theoretical framework. And so how we work is once the lab members are in good relations with one another, we may approach a community partner like the BC Assembly of First Nations, and we say, hey, BC Assembly of First Nations, what are your research and or your resources needs to advance or to develop your work and engagement with Two-Spirit people? And so we go through this process in which that they drive the research process, because they're going to ask a question. And because they're not asking for shits and giggles, First Nations Health Authority has reached out to us, one of their programs, because they want to develop a social media campaign that addresses suicide and suicidation for Two-Spirit and Indigenous, queer, and LGBT Indigenous people. And we can help them through our research and our quantitative analysis to inform that social marketing campaign that they want to develop. And so I just want to share with you that where for Western research, and again, here is that non-Indigenous ways of knowledge production that often Indigenous, within Western knowledge production, there's a separation between knowing research and doing, which you can kind of see as the policymakers in the decision, right? Where knowing happens in a vacuum, and it's usually in isolation, one researcher sitting by themselves doing all the work, right? And then once they have their truth or their finding, then you have to bring in knowledge translation folks to like bring it over to policymakers. And so there's a bifurcation of knowing and doing. We don't work this way because it's highly problematic. Like this researcher with well and good intentions, we're like, we want to count purple widgets, right? So they do all this work, get a grant, get this money, and they count purple widgets, right? Only then to have knowledge translations to take their purple widget findings out to community. And the community's like, yeah, purple widgets are going to do nothing to our basic reality. It's green widgets and their relationship to pink widgets. That's going to help us out. And then by that being, the investment has already been made by the researcher, and they're like, yeah, all we have are purple widget information, right? And so how we address that is looking at indigenous or relational knowledge translation, but it's also just research. So what we do is we invite people into our canoe. And then, from the example is that maybe our team members from the lab, but then it will also be a calling in of like the BC Assembly of First Nations, right? Join us on this tour. And you can also see that there's going to be different roles. Like we have a navigator, we have someone who is making sure that we're going in a good direction. The person with the blue shirt and the green pants is like, I got to take a little bit of a rest. They're like, you rest, I'll row, right? How do we equalize the size of the paddle and equalize the work? So once we have folks that are in the canoe, then what we do is, where do we want to go? Do we want to start off in a creek? Do a program or project evaluation or development, and the creek goes into a river. And do we want to start in a river, and do we want to do some policy work? Or do we want to go to the delta and or to the big body of water where the river dumps into and go to culture and beyond research? But it's we within the canoe, we decide where we want to go on our journey. And how that happens. And so what we've done is we overlaid it and we've bridged that chasm that's created by Western knowledge production of like, this is how we produce knowledge and how that all happens for us. And so this is our critique, but it is also our model of how we are trying to fundamentally address knowledge, or it's an ontological challenge to Western knowledge production. So how does that functionally look like in research? So we work and have primarily, because of our relationship with the Community-Based Research Center, we've been working with the Sex Now data and the survey, which is one of Canada's largest and longest national periodic survey. We have been working, and what I'm going to show you an example is from the 2015 data set. And it is through our engagement with the 2015 data set that we revised the 2018 and all of the subsequent research surveys to better capsulate health research and experiential knowledges of Indigenous participants within the Sex Now survey. Sex Now survey is a sexual health and mental health for those who identify as masculine or men who have had sex with another man within the last 5 years and are 16 and older. But it's a mental health and sexual health survey. So in 2015, when the formative years of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, we were looking at the 2015 Sex Now survey, and we'll see that gender identity was asked in question number 1 or Q1, and Two-Spirit was offered as an option or a variable. And then we saw that in question 2, when we asked to describe your sexual identity, Two-Spirit was also offered as a variable. And then way at the back of the survey in question 70, what best describes your ethnic or cultural origins, and we were offered Aboriginal. And then we were like, let's pull the results, right? And in pulling the results, we saw that there were the sample that we could work is that 4% of the overall sample were Aboriginal, with a count of 363 participants. And of those 353, 156 selected Two-Spirit either in Q1 or Q2. And I got all excited. I was like, wow, that's a big sample size, right? And I was like, tap the brakes. How many people who answered the question of Two-Spirit in Q1 or Q2 actually identified as Aboriginal in Q70? And what we found was that 62% were not Aboriginal. And so we had to blow them all out of our research and our study. So what we did was we offered the following revisions to the 2018 survey. In the 2018 survey, what we did was we asked for Two-Spirit to be walled off so non-Indigenous people could not use it and could not claim it as theirs. So we asked the question, are you Indigenous? Then we said, if you selected that, then you got the question of, are you First Nations, Métis, Inuit, prefer to self-describe? Because maybe we just, are missing it, because those are all three colonial terms, or prefer not to say, because sometimes it's not safe to say. So if the individual said, I'm First Nations, or answered whatever, then and only then were you given the question of what are you Two-Spirit? And so the results of that, we had a 9% increase, so kind of like a doubling of our rate of participation of Indigenous participants, with the following split of like 60, 40, 3% for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. 42% of the Indigenous respondents used the term Two-Spirit, but 0% of the respondents were not Indigenous. And so what we did was we effectively walled off the term for Two-Spirit, and we centered it within this cultural or racial or ethnic question. And so this is our methodology that we were using of how better to capture who Two-Spirit people are. And this was the first question. And then later on in the survey, then they were getting the question of sexual identity as well as gender identity. And although Two-Spirit didn't show up, there was an open, you prefer to self-describe, so you could write in Two-Spirit. But for myself, I'm a gay man, right? So I've answered Two-Spirit over here in this racial column that I could identify as write in Two-Spirit, but I could also select gay. And for gender, I could select man and write in Two-Spirit or not. It can just identify as a man. And so it's just, there's a way in which that we are asking and walling off Two-Spirit for only Two-Spirit relatives within your survey. CIHR, the Canadian Institute for Health Research, asked us to help them articulate this method. And so we, Travis and I, the other co-PI of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, what we did was type this up. And so it's published, and I'll send you the link in the follow-up with the video of the Two-Spirit Awareness Day. Now, another really good example in 2018, when we were looking at the survey design, Q19 read, in the past year, which of the following resources have you gone to? And you can see that these are all kind of like Western modalities of healing, right? Psychiatrist, registered counselor, social worker, sex therapist, or none of the above, right? And I was like, yeah, sometimes we go to our elders and knowledge keepers as Indigenous people for these same services, right? And so I know that there are Indigenous people that selected only those two first responses, right? And in absence of those responses, an Indigenous person would be like, well, no, I'm not going to any of these because I'm going to an elder. And I would select none of the above, right? And then as good researchers, we'd be like, how many Indigenous people are going to these folks? And they selected none of the above, yet they may be going to knowledge keepers and elders. And then we would have the finding of like, oh, we have to develop a campaign for clinical psychologists so that they can like attract Two-Spirit and Indigenous people to do clinical psychological therapy, right? Well, no, we are accessing services. It's just whether or not you acknowledge that service. And you can kind of see, do the people that you are trying to engage, are their realities mirrored within your survey instrument or your question and your survey design? Also, for the decolonizing and challenging research is within quantitative analysis, there's this concept. It plays out in this cartoon, right? So the apple goes, hey, we're both round. We both grow on trees. We're both fruit, so that must make us the same, right? And the orange goes, yeah, noodle, we're not the same, right? But this is really how health research happens, and most research happens. Most quant that bleeds into program as well as policy design. This is called and known as testing the null hypothesis. With the null hypothesis, we assume that there are no differences that exist between groups. And if a difference is found, these results in innumerable studies, many studies that establish that health indicators of Indigenous people are different from non-Indigenous counterparts, not contributing any new knowledge, but merely rehashing that is already known. We're different. And it also replaces the responsibility of change on the unhealthier group. By accepting these differences exist, we acknowledge that health inequities exist, but we do nothing to address those inequities. Now, what the heck are you saying? Me. As a really good example, and you can pick up any kind of quant research, you will see similar statements. Like if you look at the BCCDC's 2016 HIV surveillance report, and on page 11, it says, Indigenous women are 20 times greatly impacted by HIV than white women. Well, is that a fair comparison? You know, I was born an Indian. I'm going to die an Indian. I'm never going to be white. So why should we be compared to white people? Secondly, is that because all of the interlocking systems of oppression have been written and constructed by white people for white people, they're always going to have better health outcomes. We're always going to be in a less than position. And so that system of null hypothesis is not only, it becomes a site of white supremacy, that white people will always have better outcomes than us as in minorities. But two, how do we close that? Do we make the white women have the same rates of HIV as Native women? Or do we just assumption, the assumption is that we just have to make Native women more like the white women? So the null hypothesis also becomes a site of not only white supremacy, but it also implicitly, but it also becomes a site of colonization of like, how do we close that gap? So the Two-Spirit Dry Lab, we do not use the null hypothesis. We already know that Indigenous people differ from non-Indigenous people. We know that. So what we do is large data set, we extract the Indigenous components and we compare Indigenous people to Indigenous people. So going back to our example, we can compare apples to apples. Like we can say, there are 3 different types of apples, right? Or we can look at the different types of oranges and we compare, and we compare oranges to oranges. And I think thereby is Indigenous relatives to Indigenous people, and thereby they were not affirming white supremacy, and nor is it becoming a site of colonization. Now, the other thing that we do is, because we have that, is we are also fundamentally challenging, and this is another ontological challenge to the academy, but also to Western knowledge production. With this beautiful quote from Audre Lorde, who was this amazing social justice warrior. The quote that if you've taken any gender courses, you have that quote, like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And there's always this pivot and conversation around that. But I think it's worth that we unpack and we flesh out that quote a little bit more. Because Audre said, for those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged in the crucible of differences, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our differences and make them our strengths, just like the lab does of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Yeah, we fundamentally agree with Audrey. However, there are some good tools. Remember, we have the two-eyed seeing. Quant and quantitative analysis is a good thing. However, when quant is married with the null hypothesis, not a cool thing. But quant, mathematical relationships, that's what we can do that. So what we do is we actually take some of the master's tools, and we ignore the master's house, and we go down the street and we build our own village and our community with some of the master's tools. So what does that look like in research? So here is, for this study that we did on the drivers of sexual health knowledge, is there's this new theory. It's called the theory of syndemics. It's not that new. It was coined in 1994 by Merrill Singer. And what Merrill Singer showed, and he was studying HIV within the Latino community, is that there were these mutual reinforcing interactions of disease and social conditions, right? Synergy fueling an epidemic, or a syndemic, or the theory of syndemics, right? And what Singer showed was, like, if someone was experiencing violence, it may increase their chances of getting 10%. Well, don't quote me on the 10. I'm just keeping these nice whole numbers, right? An individual who is experiencing substance use, maybe 10% increase, or adverse mental health, 10%. And so you would think that in individuals that are experiencing violence, substance, and adverse mental health, it would be 10 plus 10 plus 10 equals a 30% chance. Well, no, what they showed, Singer showed quantitatively, is that there was this mutual reinforcing. So someone is that experiencing 2 or 3 or more drivers of these social conditions may increase their chances of getting HIV to 95%. And so for our drivers of sexual health paper, and I'll send you a link to that also, is that we did not use, that was the master's house. Because when I go to ceremony, and I climb into the sweat lodge, my forehead hits the ground, and I say this expression, it's a Sioux expression of metakyosin. And metakyosin translates into all my relations, or everything is connected. That sound familiar? Yeah. So for our paper of on the drivers of sexual health knowledge, we did not affirm the master's house as syndemics. We used our theory and the theory of metakyosin, showing how everything is connected and how everything is related into one cohesive system. And we quantitatively shown the mathematical relationships with the drivers of sexual health knowledge. Now, these are all a part about, like, our water teachings, and I just want to quickly go through these next couple of slides. This is a picture, and what we do is we learn from water, and water informs. And so I've already kind of hinted, but I just want to make sure that I'm drawing this into attention for you all. These are some of the work that we have been done from Hoopa, which is a First Nations community in Northern California, all the way to Haida Gwaii, and the work that we did on Haida Gwaii. In that when we roll in, what we do is we don't come with an assumption. As water, we take the path of least resistance. We only go where we're invited. So we're no longer fighting. Fighting is not sustainable. But being in good relations and being invited and called in to do the work, that is completely sustainable. And then once the lab rolls into community, we allow community to give us shape, just like water would give us shape. What are your research needs? How do you want us to be? And how can we help you to be a better community? And so we're not building capacity, we're bridging capacity. Because there is capacity within communities. Like, Indigenous people were not supposed to be here. You know, if the colonial project was realized, one, we as Indigenous people, we would be extinct. Or two, we would be here and we would not know who we are as Indigenous people. There's capacity, and we have always had the capacity to survive, to resist, and for us to live another day. So we're not building anything. We're bridging and building on those strengths that we as Indigenous people have been doing to exist in this world since time immemorial. And so we also follow our moon teachings of our logo. Our logo is designed by Margaret August, a Two-Spirit artist. And it is reflective of both masculinity and femininity, and also and the balance between those. And then the salmon forehead, the two salmon facing each other, is also our nod that most of our lab members are here located on Coast Salish territory. And so it's honoring of that. So and it's also a moon that reflects the many phases within the research, Indigenous and Two-Spirit research process. So for us, and following moon teachings is in a new moon, the relationship is established or reestablished. We're like, hey, Hoopa, hey, Haidagwai, what do you want to do? And then in the waxing crescent phase of the moon is that we get to know one another. Who are you? What do you do? And what does the lab do, right? And then in the first quarter, what we do is we find out our research needs and or resources to sustain or to develop their work with their Two-Spirit relatives. Then within the waxing gibbous, the refinement of the research question and or the resource. Like, so community is like, we want to look at pet ownership and health, right? Well, because we don't ask the question around pet ownership, so maybe we find another indicator. So we just have to refine it, right? And we're bound by our different data sets, right? And then once we get our marching orders, then within our full moon, the lab goes into this deep reflection, but also the work of the data analysis and the resource development. Within the waiting gibbous, we go back to our community partner, and we were like, here is our initial findings and or resource. And is this what we heard? Is there a refinement, or are there better questions that we could ask, right? And then once we do that secondary analysis or the refinement analysis in the third quarter, a final report of our findings and or resources is transferred to the partner. And within that it's however the partner wants it. If they want an oral report, they want a PowerPoint, they want an infographic, they want a form, like however they want it, we will package the knowledge up to them. And that's knowledge translation or knowledge mobilization, right? And then finally, within the waning crescent, we go back to our community partner, like, hey, community partner, can we type up these results and maybe go for a journal article? And if the community partner says, no, that's our knowledge, right? And they're like, cool, good. But if they say yes, then we start a new relationship and we go back into the new moon, right? But you can kind of see how we fundamentally structured this. In that for the waning crescent, once we've typed up our results and hopefully we get published in a tier 1 journal article, if no one reads our paper, we don't give a crap's ass. Oops, you're recording. We don't care if no one reads our article, because the knowledge and the medicine is already out there in that third quarter. The community is already acting on the teachings and the medicine. And so that's where there is that we're bridging, and we're not doing like knowing and doing as separate things. Knowing and doing becomes one, or in indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing in the research ecosystem. Whereas Haidagwai right now, we're in knowledge, we're in resource development. And within the Hoopa people, we're still redeveloping and trying to figure out what do they really want or they really need. And so again, they move in cycle with us. And so we can place folks into this, our phases of relational accountability. Now, when health research is collected in a culturally safe and affirming way, health researchers are given the opportunity to promote more rigorous science that considers sex and all genders from a decolonial framework as Two-Spirit people. Research conducted in this way has the potential to expand our understanding of health within an intersectional framework that considers how determinants such as ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, disability, sexual orientation, migration, age, and geography mutually constitutes in sex and or in gender. By bringing these considerations into focus, they help formulate health research to better inform policies and programs that are more relevant, respectful, mindful, but I would also say loving, and that is reflective of the diversity that is situated with Two-Spirit and Indigenous peoples. Now, when we look at this waterfall, or we look at the majesty of the Niagara Falls, and we're like, "Schnikes, that is so beautiful. How can I recreate that?" I must remind you that this waterfall, as well as the Niagara Falls, began by but one water droplet. And that water droplet joining with another, and they finding more to build this beautiful. So it's always seeking out your relations and finding those other water droplets, finding community of support and practice. Finally, the other water teaching that I take as a really good example of is the Grand Canyon. And we look at the Grand Canyon in the Colorado River. We're like, "Schnikes, how can I build that? That's huge, right?" But just like water is to be mindful, to be patient, constant, slowly doing the work. If we were to try to create this Grand Canyon and this picture in one day, how incredibly violent and disruptive would that be? Like water, we must be mindful, patient, and consistent, and great and beautiful things will happen. References, QQC, and again, I talk way too much. Stop sharing.
That was awesome. I just have this feeling to just say, thank you for that. But Louisa, did you want to share anything?
Are we muted?
We're on now.
Oh, okay. I do, and I thank the presenter for that very informative presentation. We have teachings from my ancestors about Two-Spirit. For the male, we call them Ragashbala, which means they're acting feminine. And for the women is Wawispala, which it's describing that they're acting masculine. And that each person is gifted with the two spirits. And in my ancestors' teachings, that they were highly respected. And when we talk about Nola, which in my language means something that's very sacred, something that is unexplainable. But we are taught that we must be respectful to that person or whatever it is. It could be an animal, a person, the environment. And that I like the one of the analogies, two-eyed seeing, with the when they're gifted, both the feminine and the masculine, that they're able to see things in two ways, and which gives them that spiritual entity that was given to them by the Creator, and we don't question it. We just merely appreciate and be respectful to that two-spirit person. And when I'm listening to the presentation, a lot of them are First Nations teachings, and our way is being totally respectful in all that we do, including the self. And the colonial project to kill the Indian and save the man tried so desperately to wipe out everything about us and instill a way of being that is not part of who we are. And so to hear this presentation needs to be widespread, including the government and especially the big corporations. How to act in a relational way, especially toward the land. That we are respectful. We are merely guests on somebody else's territory, and that we need to respect it all. I also like one of the sayings, for the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. You can look at that in assessing the true spirit. The true spirit was a gift from the Creator. And there's nothing we could do to try and fix it. It was a gift from the Creator, and we need to respect that. Thank you for that presentation. I got quite a bit out of it. Thank you.
Murray, did you have any?
Yeah, I do. This is really worthwhile. I got an awful lot out of it as well, and I'm glad that I did listen. But being a survivor of residential school, and I've counseled many. I have a person that's almost 90 years old yet, and is still wounded by what happened to him, and what happened to those that brought that type of behavior back to our people. This is so worthwhile, knowing that there's a gay community out there that is not harmful to anybody. And this is what I'm hearing here, that the kindness and gentleness of all of them. But how do you bring this message to my friend that's almost 90 years old that is still wounded yet? How do you bring that message to those that have been wounded by those that came back from residential school and are still practicing unhealthy behavior, and to get this message across that they're the gay people are human beings too? I've always seen it that way, and I have many friends that are gay, and in my language, it means part of. B is spelled X-B-I-I. Iota means that it refers to a woman, and she's part man. She has masculine parts of her, and for a woman, a man, you call her Bi Hana, is part woman. And one that was said to me by one of the elders from my community that knows our language, I started to understand what he's talking about. And it's not making fun, it's not poking fun at anybody. That is just a word that comes up with. And how do you bring this to a community? Just like I heard heard him say that they get invited. I know you have to be invited. You just don't go to the community and say, we got this to offer. And when you open the door for possibilities for people that are wanted to come and listen, but all the information that I heard here this past hour, all worthwhile information. And I like the words, like respectful and loving and caring. And how do you get that to the victims? How do you do that? Get all this information to them. And I want to look for that book, The Reason I Walk. I'm gonna Google that and see if I can get a hold of a book like that and read some more on it. So it was worthwhile, and my mind was busy because I'm a survivor of residential school, and I seen and heard a lot while I was there too. So, and thank you for your presentation. It is well worth it. Thank you.
Julie?
Murray.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Someone else was going to say. Louisa.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think he said just thank you.
Oh, Julie, I want to add what Murray was saying about some of the people who have been severely sexually abused in the residential school, and their sexuality was prematurely awakened as a little boy. And in adulthood, there is a lot of confusion as to their sexuality as a result of being severely sexually abused as a child. And I don't know if that has been ever touched on to try and help the people in that particular category. Thank you.
Oh, I'm
Can
still
you
on
mute?
mute. Adam, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I just want to, first of all, I
go
just have
ahead.
to respond in that both Murray and Louisa, is it Louisa? Okay, perfect. When you've you've honored me with such high words, and also the gifting of these words for your True Spirit relatives. I wish and I hope and pray that if I could work with you and Julia to get those words so that I can update the database so that we can maybe share that with more of our folks, because we don't have a lot of Canadian. Ooh, are you okay? Did you just poke yourself? Julie.
I just cut myself on a Post-it note.
Oh my God. And so I just humbly thank you from the bottom of my heart, because and this is the awkwardness also, right? Because we're doing research right now. Like I just was gifted knowledge. And I am like blown away by that. But yet CIHR doesn't look at that as this is research. They look at this as knowledge sharing or knowledge mobilization. No, this is research. And so just the sacredness of that. So I just wanted to thank you so much. And I wish that there were other lab members here to witness this, because this is the beauty, but this is the work. And you're absolutely right, Murray, in that we have to be kind, and that we must just be in space and being in good relations with one another, right? It's hard. It's easy to oppress something that you don't understand. It's easy to oppress when you think that something is less than you. And I think the power of us getting in good relations and holding space is that if you witness and honor and see my humanity, not me as a gay guy, not me as a two-spirit person, not me, just you see me as a Nehiao, then that begins that healing journey and that healing work. And then finally is hurt people hurt. And so I've experienced some nastiness from elders, and I can share some of those stories, but my thing is never to attack. Two wrongs don't make a right. What I must do is put a little tobacco down and pray for them. Because hurt people hurt. And we must take on that conversation, that deeper conversation of how do we mutually support one another in our healing journeys so that we may not hurt. And so the work of the lab, the 36 lab members, is us to bring our shit to the circle and that we get in good relations. And that means good relations with our non-Indigenous relatives, our straight cisgendered relatives, our Indigenous relatives, our Métis relatives, our First Nations relatives, bringing and becoming a community of support and a community of practice. That's really why the work of the Two-Spirit Dry Lab is that we're a lab of reconciliation or reconciliaction. We're really trying to work out these models so that we can be in good relations. So white people don't think that they're better than us. Native people don't think that we're less than, but we come as a circle. And we have 2 attending elders to make sure that we're always working in good ways. It's really a complex, and you can kind of see, I was just giving you little peeks, glimpses, but the intricacies of the work, and it's hard. It would be much easier if I was a co-PI and I just tell them what to do. Go do that analysis. But I would be replicating, and I myself would be the colonizer. And so I can't do it that way. And so we must map out these other ways. And so I was just showing you some models that we're working out by using quantitative research as a vehicle for love and a vehicle for good relations amongst all. And we are not a feelsy qualitative lab. We're doing high quant work. But I know that if we can do that in quant, the feelsy qualitative research would be probably a lot easier. But we can do it in quant, and I think that we have this winning thing. And mind you, aren't waiting for the discord to happen. We have 36 lab members from all over the world who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Black, who are First Nations, who are for Métis. We don't have an Inuit member yet. Southeast Asian, who are gay, who are straight, bi, who are poly, who are asexual. We don't care. If you want to come and join us, but you have to unpack your shit and you have to work in a good way. And I've just been dropping words all over it, and it's all recorded. And what were you going to say? And then we should jump off.
So, Kasha, I'm just going to stop the recording, actually, because I want to give space for questions. And I often find that it's best when we stop recording. So I'll do that, stopping it.